All right, bienvenidos todos. Estamos listos. I think we're all ready.
Yeah.
Welcome. It's nice to see some people. I'm on sabbatical, so I haven't seen a lot of people. So it's very nice to see people. And it's great to welcome Maria Cosio Olavide, who is here in town visiting from Madrid. He's been doing work with a fellowship at St. John's, but he agreed to give a talk here. Dr. Cosio Olavide, as I think most of you know, received his PhD in Spanish literature here at the University of Minnesota, and he had a minor in medieval studies. And that was in 2020. After that, he received a one-year postdoc, which he's finishing up at the Universidad de Alcalá in Spain. And he is currently an adjunct professor at the School of Humanities at the Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola in Peru, where he also teaches as a professor in the Graduate School of Letters of the Universidad Mayor de San Marcos. He has been very active since finishing up a couple years ago. He's published in El Humanista and the Bulletin of Spanish Cultural Studies. He has a forthcoming scholarly edition of the Libro del Caballero y el Escudero de Don Juan Manuel with Iberoamericana. And I know several other articles that I haven't mentioned, but we will be hearing about his current project, Heresy and Orthodoxy in the House of Castile, Sancho IV Lucidario. So join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for being here. And those of you who are abroad, I'm going to take my mask. Thank you for being here as well. So I'm going to talk about this book that it's often doesn't have as much light as other works in the Spanish Middle Ages. And I'll just start. Recently, Robbie Clark Patrick argued that the Sandebar, which is the Castilian translation of the Book of Sindibat, finished around 1253, represents what he called the first discursive reaction or rebellion to Alfonso X's cultural project. In this talk, I will engage with his exploration of the often nuanced and contradictory ideas held by some high-profile members of the Royal House of Castile during the second half of the 13th century, while the Sandebar, that was sponsored by Alfonso's brother, Infante Fadrique, and here we see him with his brothers, including Alfonso, that's Fadrique specifically, was the first literary, well, I was talking about the Sandebar, it was the first literary work constructed against the ideal court that Alfonso was trying to build. I argue today that it was neither the most effective nor the most vigorous reaction to that imagined community, or as Michael Jarley would call it, imagined community of empire. Some 30 years later, Alfonso was deposed by his second-born son, Sancho, who became Sancho IV, the fourth of Castile. However, Sancho would rise up against his father for a second time, but this time not with force of arms, but following Fadrique's example with the pen, ordering the composition of the Lucidario, of which I will talk today. But before going to the Lucidario, I want to briefly return to the Sandebar, because it's an interesting collection of frame tales that can be considered in political terms a first rebellion against Alfonso. It contains the same type of didactic and moralizing stories of Indian origin and Arabic transmission as many other popular books in mid-13th century Castile, such as Khalil Edibna, we all know, whose translation Alfonso had sponsored some years before, actually. But Alfonso frame tales were meant for the education of kings and courtiers in the core principles of his centralized monarchic system. He accomplished this through the inclusion of repetition of certain key values for his court: honesty, political wit, but foremost, loyalty. The Sandebar, however, is driven by a desire to transmit a single value, moderatio, as opposed to ira regia, or in Aristotle's words, an author of which we will hear a lot today, phronesis, an idea that he explains in the Nicomachean Ethics, or prudentia for the medieval Latin translators. In the Sandebar, a king sentences his sole heir to death after being convinced of his treason by a duplicitous concubine. The boy's life is saved by the contra-arguments given over 7 days by as many counselors who restrain the king's actions. They control his wrath with moralizing tales. And these tales reveal that patience should guide the decisions of the king, and that the prince is actually innocent after all. The purpose of the book is to warn about the dangers of unchecked royal ambition, for an ambitious king tends to behave in despotic manners, and they are prone to emotional excesses. Now, by Fradique's adventurous life, we have approved that the Sendebar failed to fulfill this narrative program outside of fiction. 2 years after it was completed in 1255, and having failed to defend his claim to the Duchy of Suabia, Frederick was the heir, but Alfonso gained the rights as part of his long aspiration to become Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick's discontent grew public, and the king, and he started to participate in political intrigues that forced him into exile. He would return to Castile a decade and a half later, in 1271, only to be executed 5 years after that. Lacking an image of that, here you have another royal fratricide from a century later, the Count Enrique of Trastámara ordering the execution of his brother, King Pedro, also known as the Cruel. The suspected motives for Frederick's death, ordered by Alfonso, are numerous. By his last decade of rule, the king was piling up failures. He had unsuccessfully tried to aspire to the imperial throne, and his seemingly seamless succession was thrown out of to disarray by the sudden death of his heir apparent in 1275. And to top this off, his health started deteriorating from a cancer that ended his life in 1284. Everything points out that Federico was planning, but never managed to execute a way to deal with Alfonso's recklessness by overthrowing him, and by taking the regency of the kingdom until Sancho reached the legal age to become king. It is not surprising, therefore, that this plot fits really well within the idea of royal control that he had imprinted some decades earlier in Sandebar. Now, I think it's hardly necessary or feasible to portray Alfonso's intellectual itinerary, Alfonso, who was known also for Spanish and non-Spanish as the wise king. Instead, I just want to point out something that is going to come out throughout this presentation, that among the many groundbreaking historiographical, legal, and scientific works that he wrote or translated in his Royal Scriptoria, a special group is formed by those related to the Scientia Stellarum, the study of celestial bodies and their effects on terrestrial creatures. I refer, for example, to the Lapidary that we have here. I'm going to present some images of them. I refer to the Lapidary, to the Book of the Forms and the Images, to the Book of Astromagic, to the Perfect Book of the Judgment of the Stars, to the Book of the Crosses, if it passes. Oh, I missed this one. To the Book of the Crosses, the Book of Knowledge of Astrology, and finally to the Alphonsine Tables. These works deal with borderline illicit forms of knowledge. They were written under the influence of Aristotle's treatises on natural philosophy and its Arabic commentators, mainly Averroes, who had been recently translated in Toledo by Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott. These last translations caught like wildfire in early to mid-13th century Castile, and were responsible for what scholars nowadays call the Iberian heterodox Aristotelianism, a school of thought well represented by Alfonso's books. A series of works sponsored by Alfonso's son Sancho offered an immediate and decisive response to his father's astrological production. Among them is the Lucidario, which contests the king's appetite to know the mysteries of nature, which, as the Castilian Book of Alexandre warns, was a form of knowledge forbidden to men by God, comparable only to the Luciferian arrogance of the Macedonian king. And here we have a passage of the Poema de Alexandre that talks about Alexander trying to understand the conquerir las secretas naturas, y dice, nunca mayor soberbia cometió Lucifer. Now, in the introduction to the sole edition of the Lucidario, the work that we're talking about today, Richard Kincaid affirms that the book is a translation and an amplification of Honorius of Autун's Lucidario, this Latin text. Something that is still believed by some people, but it's not quite correct. This Latin text is a didactic pastoral work written during the early scholasticism of the late 11th century that gained widespread popularity in Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. Its contents, however, are meant for a different audience than Sancho. It's a type of teacher's manual to educate low-level clerics in the fundamental beliefs of Christianity. It offers them effective resources to teach an audience of uneducated laymen, something that was necessary before more advanced predication was developed in Europe, brought about by the Lateran reforms and the Mendicant orders. This explains that it uses really strong and exaggerated language to depict phenomena and concepts like the fall of divine grace, the persistence of sin in the world, Christ's sacrifice, and the salvific role of the church. Now, Sancho's work, the Lucidario, is also full of theological explanations. And I say here Sancho's book, but we should keep in mind that it's a collaborative authorship among a royal patron and the scholars that work in his court, as my colleague Anita Sabo from Boston University kindly reminded me. As I was saying, these theological explanations are meant for a more educated readers. The book was written in the shadow of the 13th century scholasticism, and particularly within this tradition, the encyclopedism that Mary Franklin Brown, who was with us up until a couple of years ago, has studied so thoroughly. And as such, it includes many profound revisions of Aristotle's teachings, along with remarkable scientific descriptions of the Iberian Peninsula. For example, it talks about the migratory routes taken by birds across the peninsula, or what are the hunting techniques used by Cantabrian whalers. Now, with this work, what Sancho is trying to do is to make accessible knowledge to a wider audience. And here I cannot stop but to think in the sense of the word vulgariser in French, which is to diffuse knowledge, to make vulgar. Like in this nice vulgarization of the Middle Ages that we saw Thomas Aquinas, someone that we're going to talk about today. And Thomas Aquinas is like, and he's always passing by this same place to do this Marilyn Monroe type of thing, showing that under reason there's always faith, right? He concludes by saying he makes explicit case of passing always by there. So Sancho is trying to show the sound scientific knowledge of his time. And in this, he's not different than his father. But yet, the way that he does it, it cannot be more different, because he subjects all knowledge of nature to a strict doctrinal framework sustained by Christian beliefs. Another aspect that sets the Latin text of which I spoke earlier and the Castilian work is that the first two share characters. There's a magister and a discipulus, a teacher and a disciple. With the second, in the Latin text, working just as a receiver. He's a vessel for the knowledge the wisdom that his master gives him. But in the Castilian text, the discipulo has an active role. He starts the whole story by approaching his older master, his old maestro, because having studied theology with him, he has since heard the teachings of other masters in the schools of his city. And that's what he says. From them, he has learned things that contradict this previous education. And here I have a long quote. You can follow it in Spanish or in English. Many times I go to these schools to see how good they are, he says to him, and to listen to the masters that teach there. I once happened to enter one where they teach the art they call nature, the naturas in Spanish. And there was a big debate between the students and their teacher. And such was the impression caused in me by the things I heard, and in this I want to be honest with you, that I returned many times to listen, so I could learn more. Now, what are these arts of nature? The arts of nature are no other than Aristotle's natural philosophy, condemned as contrary to the teachings of the church just some years before the Lucidario was written by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier. And the Lucidario starts with this dialogue, but before that, there is a first-person prologue of Sancho that I want to pay some attention, where he explains the purpose of the utility of the book, as is common in medieval prologues. Ana Montero points out that since this prologue, since this beginning, the Lucidario presents itself as an answer to the Aristotelian views of certain intellectuals, those that we just saw in this presentation, these maestros in the escuelas, who cast doubts on the primacy of the church's teachings, called in the prologue a gran herejía, a great heresy. The king has cautionary words for them in the prologue. He says, Men's understanding tries to extend and apprehend and understand more things than what is given for them to know. Not content with understanding the functioning of the terrestrial things, they also want to understand the celestial ones. And even though they know all these things, including their origins and virtues, for each type of knowledge possesses a virtue, they are still discontent. Thus, with their eagerness for great knowledge, they try to know what is not for them to know, what God did not want them to know. Now, I believe that this denunciation was aimed at two different manifestations of what I previously called the heterodox Aristotelian doctrines of the 13th century Castile. On the one hand, it refers to the ideas that developed early in the 13th century, when Castilian and Leonese intellectuals started presenting and defending these ideas in the Studium Generale of Palencia and on the schools of Leon and Burgos. And these ideas were considered so dangerous that they were condemned and prescribed by the Faculty of Theology of Paris in 1215, along with many teachings of Aristotle's natural philosophy. Well, we don't have any works of this group, fantastically or sadly. We only have one name, Mauritius Hispanus. They appear to be the same Leonese philosophers who Lucas, Bishop of Tuy, Lucas de Tuy, describes as heretics in his De Altera Vita. And he speaks here in the Altera Vita of this heretici qui philosophorum seu naturalium nomine gloriantur, these heretics calling themselves natural philosophers. Qui philosophos mundis Platonem Aristotelem et ceteros nostris veris philosophies anteponunt ecclesiae Christi doctoribus, that prefer the teachings of pagan philosophers like Aristotle or Plato to the doctors of the church, and who call the doctors of the church idiotas vel peritus, idiots and ignorance. He also describes how they meet in this locus ordissimo, this like really sordid place, to perform miracles with which they attract the feeble-minded clerics, meaning they do scientific experiments, right? On the other hand, so this is one group of Aristotelians. On the other hand, I suspect that Sancho's works in the prologue also refer to a different iteration of this peninsular Aristotelianism closer in time to him, the one that I just mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one that he could not publicly denounce. For some of the philosopher's ideas, contrary to Christian dogma and biblical hermeneutics, are present in Alfonso's books. And we will go into detail later, but here you see the first folio of the Lucidario, the Book of Stones, which I showed before, but now there's a zoom. And the large illustration shows no other than Aristotle, teaching to his followers. An attitude that, if we pay some attention, is mimicked in the illustrated letter, which is with the king. Well, Aristotle is holding a book, teaching his audience, and the king has the same spot as the philosopher, holding a book and addressing an audience, two people. Another comparison in this manuscript is set forth by the letter A that holds the image of the king, which is the first letter of Alfonso's name, but at the same time of Aristotle's in Spanish. And if we read the text, says Aristotle, that A continues, Aristotle, the most perfect among philosophers, and who most naturally explained all things according to true reason and made them be understood as they are. Said that all things under the heavens move and act in accordance to the movement of celestial bodies. This is just an illustration of Alfonso's man crush on Aristotle. And as I was saying, the presence of Aristotle, more disputed ideas in Alfonso's books was a problem, for it meant the king himself, center of the social order, supported their validity. Therefore, the Lucidario attempts to resolve this opposition between two forms of knowledge, which in a passage Sancho says stand one against the other, theology and nature. The same science of nature, he explains, is formed by all the knowledge of living beings along the terrestrial, aerial, and astronomical phenomena. It is Aristotle's natural philosophy, which can be known by all men, regardless of faith, he says, in what might be, furthermore, an oblique reference to the popularity of Averroes' commentaries among Christian Castilian philosophers. and he says this knowledge, Sancho says, this knowledge of nature is shared by all the peoples of the world, and it is used by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. This also implies that this is a form of knowledge that can be gained directly by reason, and not a revealed truth that requires a dogmatic acceptance. But above science stands the knowledge brought by theology, which from Sancho's stance, Orthodox stance, is the only thing that can explain and make comprehensible the contingency of natural events. And here we're going deeper into philosophy. This is quite contrary to Alfonso's cherished scientific phenomenology, because he focuses on phenomena through science. But in the Lucidario, however, theology is understood as the study of the first causes and the meanings of sensible phenomena, things that do not lie in the material things themselves and cannot be understood just by reason. But the prologue is vague in explaining what is at the core of theology, something that does not happen with the science of nature, indissolubly linked with Aristotle's teachings. Yet it is clear as to a certain thing that theology relies on revealed truth, and therefore dogma, whose foundations lie in the scriptures and the writings of the Church's fathers, profusely quoted in the book. And moreover, the king also establishes that to solve the opposition between theology and philosophy, one must accept the power of divine action, God, which operates through miracles, and he says, where neither nature nor any other thing plays a role. No? In a way, Sancho here is working with concepts introduced by, this is a paradox, but he's also working with concepts introduced by Aristotle's, with Averroes' Latin translators, like Michael Scott, mainly Michael Scott, who in the Commentaria Magna, the long commentaries of Averroes to the physics and the metaphysics of Aristotle, he proposes something that Sancho is applying. He's proposing a dualism between the knowledge of the creator, natura naturans, and the knowledge of creation, natura naturata, what is created. This conceptual dualism with knowledge either in natural philosophy or in theology also invites a reader familiar with the king's intellectual world to propose another comparison, one between the different attitudes held by Alfonso and by Sancho about knowledge itself. On the one shore stands Alfonso's scientific curiosity, and on the other, Sancho's renewing return to orthodoxy, reflected in something that you have seen at the beginning of this talk, which is a quotation from one of his books, a quotation of Psalm 110, according to the Vulgata, Initium sapiense timor domine, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which also appears in the book of Proverbs, and if we remember the book of Proverbs, it also says, et scientia sanctorum prudentiam, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. Sancho goes further in the prologue than in this other work, suggesting that this position can also be applied to other things that set him apart from his father. Now, we're going to continue a bit in the prologue still. Sancho considers that his royal status is a gift from God, and he says that so. He says the creator not only made him the son of a king, but among all of Alfonso's sons and grandsons, chose him for the throne. And I'm quoting, he took away all those born before us so we could obtain this seat. And he says something like this seat, which is his, that is of a king. And then he compares this situation with the divine intervention that allowed David to become king of Israel, even though he was his father's youngest. And if we remember a bit Sunday school, a comparison that also puts Alfonso in a bad place, because Alfonso would be the previous king of Israel before David, who was Saul. And Saul didn't end his days nicely. He ended tormented by an evil spirit sent by God for disobeying him. And Alfonso died of a cancer that took his mind away. So this game of mirrors has several levels. Another one, implicit in the comparisons, is the existence of two orders. The first is the natural order of men, codified in Castilian law, written by Alfonso, which establishes that the throne should go to the descendants of Alfonso's firstborn. And above this stands the supranatural order of God and his providence, which makes Sancho the legitimate heir to the eyes of God, clearing his path to the throne. With this action, Sancho says, the creator, and I'm quoting, wanted to let all know he wanted to lead our cause into the state that we now hold, and to have his name, which is the name of king. Before I said that Sancho attempts to reconcile Aristotle's natural philosophy with theology, for he speaks of the necessity of an agreement between them. But his real intentions are to introduce Aristotle's ideas into a scholastic scheme, where the highest order, which organizes and guides the remaining, is the divine. Now, considering the 13th century scholasticism, this form of harmonization of knowledge of the pagan classical world with the church's teaching shows a double influence, at least. One is the mendicant encyclopedism, Franklin Brown comes to mind, that was pretty well known in Sancho's court. Bartolomeo Anglicus, Albertus Magnus, Vicente de Beauvais, and on the other side, Aquinas' theology, whose organizing principle, the Questiones Disputate, is evident in the form that the work takes place. And now let's talk a bit about the work itself. It's a question and answer type of thing. So the disciple asks him, "Oh, what is this?" And this master will say, "Okay, here, let me explain to you." Now, the first question is, what is the first thing in heaven? And like all the answers, the master will answer in two parts. The first one from natural philosophy, from the standpoint of natural philosophy, and the second one from theology. For the first part, he will say that he will use what is probably Aristotle's most known contribution to cosmogonic theory, that comes from the Lambda book of the Metaphysics, completely present in Alfonso's books, the theory of the Premodern, the first mover. He says, you should know that according to nature, the world had a beginning. And if it had one, it is necessary that there was a maker for that beginning. Now, the theological answer rounds up this argument. He uses Aquinas' interpretation of the metaphysics, and he says that this beginner, this maker, was God, something that Aristotle never says. And he also says that the existence of the mover, of the creator, that stands above his creation, implies that the world is finite, it will have an end. An explanation that he only can find in scriptures. And we will go back to this because this is a really heavy argument of the whole, of the ideas that Sancho is trying to present here. Some chapters later, the disciple asked him to settle a disputed point between theologians and philosophers. In which of the heavens lies God? According to the medieval interpretation of Aristotle, the first mover resides in the ninth heaven, which is what Alfonso's book on astrology say. And this is a quote from the Centenary. This is the belief, faith, and perfect love of our Lord Jesus Christ, not taken from the elements, nor from the seventh heavens, nor the eighth heaven, but from the ninth, which stands above the rest. As philosophers and wise men from the past have said, using their knowledge, they also showed it was God's home and dwelling, for it did not move, but made all the other heavens move. And the virtue of the ninth heaven is that it stays put and does not move, which we call the power of the Father. Now, let's unravel this. Earlier, the master had offered some signs of rejecting the idea of putting God in a place. In a previous question, he had argued that before and during creation, God was nowhere and in everything. An affirmation that reminds the reader that the medieval interpretation of Aristotle contradicted the creation of the Bible, ex nihilo, of nothing. For it diminished the creator powers, and Sancho says, it is true he created everything. Now he was nowhere, yet everything was in him. This is because he's God. Because if God could only stay in one place, then he would be diminished, and no more than any carnal man. For he would not possess more power than any other man, but he was in everything, and his creation, which he made and still makes, wasn't him. Putting the creator in the ninth heaven is problematic for Sancho. Now, going back to the question of where he is or what is, the master uses this last reasoning to refuse to place God in one of the spheres. This would make him contingent, limiting his necessary omnipotence and his capacity to intervene in creation. He says, you should know that God is everywhere, therefore he is in each of the nine heavens. For he is also in earth and in purgatory and hell, and in the oceans and in every other place. For such are his greatness and his power, that he is everywhere, there is one of his creatures and creations. Now, some chapters later, the master uses his answer about the state of creation after the date of judgment to charge once more against Aristotelian doctrine. Now he focuses shifting the place from where God is to when is the world going to end. He shifts his focus to something more important, which is the doctrine of the eternity of the world, which Averroes popularized in his Magna Commentaria Magna, and which is also prohibited by the condemnations of Paris. There's this Bishop of Paris in, I want to say, 1277, yes, that brings out 219 condemnations of doctrines that are against the Catholic faith or the Christian dogma, and most of them come from Aristotle and Averroes' interpretation, particularly these three, right? Like the world is eternal and that all the species in it, and so the world is not going to end. And I'm going to explain why in a while. The master, however, says that all living things live in the sublunar world, so below the last sphere, which is the moon. But when the world ends, men and all other animals will die. He goes further to say that this event will also affect the bodies that are above the moon, the supralunar bodies, for the planets and the stars in the heavens will stand still. A claim that he's backing up by paraphrasing Isaiah 7:65. For the saints said that from that day on, there will be new heavens and new earth. Now, I've been talking about this, but I haven't shown you the images, so let's go to that. According to Aristotle, the spheres and the celestial bodies contained therein were perfect and incorruptible, and they were kept in an endless movement started by the first mover. Here we have Johannes de Sacrobostos de Sfera, which with Earth in the first sphere, then Moon, Mercury, Venus, and the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sfera, I have it here, the Sfera Stellarum Fixarum, the sphere of the fixed stars, and at top, the Primum Mobile, right? God. Now, in anything that is below the moon is composed, according to Aristotle, by beings composed by the four elements, Empedocles again, organisms that are subject to change because they're part of this perpetual cycle of corruption and renewal. But the master is objecting to this. He's taking his ideas from Aquinas. In some of his writings, I'm thinking of the Potencia and the Cielo, he says that the day of judgment will also mean the cessation of everything. The heavens will stop moving. He argues that this will translate into anything that is below the heavens, which therefore will stop this cycle of generation. So no more movement of the stars, no more generation and renewal, which Aristotle described, and then the world therefore is not eternal. Now, piggybacking on the spirit of this theological answer, the master adds a new rejection to Aristotle's doctrine. And now he uses Aristotle. This is really cute. He says, we find that Aristotle said in the 8th book of physics that according to nature, the world cannot cease to exist or have an end. This is like this doctrine condemned. Now he's glossing the physics. And by glossing them, he allows himself to explain that what Aristotle actually wanted to say was that the world was not going, wasn't that the world was not going to end, but he was talking about beings of the sublunar world and how they could not lose their capacity for regeneration. He says, Aristotle says this because God created the world and ordered the course of nature he established for it. And according to this course, it is necessary that some beings to be born while others die. This is why he said that generation begets generation and this will continue forever. And since nature's generation will not end, he shows that the world will not end. So he's explaining Aristotle. Now, he's introducing some weird concepts in the Spanish version of this, because this is kind of a tongue twister. We have mundo, mundo, mundo everywhere. So the world's not going to end. But what does he understand by mundo? And here's where the master starts cheating. Because he is working with two meanings shared by the word mundo in Latin or in Castilian. On the one hand, we have creation, cosmos, no? An eternal reality, but often or more often than not, Earth. But on the other hand, mundo can also mean the inhabitants of the world, mankind, a change in reality. So to solve the confusion of what Aristotle said by saying that the world is not going to end, he introduces a third term, and he's going to start cheating because he says that mundo is related to mudar, from the Latin mutare, to change, to transform. So what Aristotle really wanted to say was he calls world all living creatures that dwell on earth. And therefore, the world means things that change. And this change occurs in one of two ways. The first is when men and other creatures move from one place to another, and the second is when they transition from life to death. Therefore, this thing on which we live and change is called earth, and we who live on it are the world. So we are the world, and we are going to end. So Aristotle was right, actually. By insisting on the importance of death for the sublunar world, populated by terrestrial beings, the master reasserts the contingency of these beings, contradicting Aristotle's medieval interpretation. He says later, I don't know if I have this, no, I don't have it. If us living beings of earth come to an end, it's therefore necessary that the world must have an end, for we are the world. That's it. In this scenario, with all the creation made up by contingent beings and bodies, the only remaining eternal things for the master are, for the Bible, God, his angels, and the human souls he created. Now, the master's gloss is creating a better, or at least a more palpable Aristotle, one that aligns himself better with the teachings of the church. Only after reinterpreting the philosopher, the master accepts his ideas and brings himself to say that they are called the reason of truth, la razón de la verdad, he says. He is, however, unwavering in his suspicion of Aristotle, and he concludes his argument by claiming that the conclusions reached by reason are not as perfect as those reached by the reason of virtue, the wisdom derived from faith, a pale reflection of the perfect knowledge that can be only found in God. And he finishes this whole argumentation saying, God crowns all wisdom, for he created all things, for there is no nature or anything that can argue against his actions, because he is above nature himself. Q-U-E-D, right? That's what you say in English. It stands. This last answer allows me to return to something that they say about the prologue, something that Sancho said in the prologue, that I had left aside on purpose. In his warning of the dangers of the ideas of Aristotle's thought, Sancho says that natural philosophers are not satisfied with understanding the workings of the sublunar and the celestial worlds. He says that they want to understand what happens in the divine omniscience. How do you call it? How do you pronounce it? Omniscience? Omniscience?
Omniscience.
Omniscience, in the divine omniscience. And he says, with their eagerness for great knowledge, they try to know what is not for them to know and what God did not want them to know. For the gospel says, it is not for you to know the times or the moments which my Father has put in his power, for when he saw that it was the time and the season to use them and allow you to understand. So we're trying to go into things that they shouldn't. Although astrology and the study of the stars effects on human destiny was an accepted discipline, or accepted disciplines in the European learning centers of the 13th century, as Laura Fernandez, a specialist on this, has noted, the successive condemnations of Aristotle's teachings in Paris highlighted that astrology in fact contradicted the church's ideas by this point. Thereby, these condemnations started reducing the popularity of these disciplines by the middle of the century. Sancho's words echo this critique. Astrology tries to comprehend something that for theology is not comprehensible. And this takes us back to the conflict that I proposed between Alfonso and Sancho. Still have some 3 pages. The first, Alfonso, who had sponsored the translation of numerous astrological and astromagical treatises, who tried to create a framework to protect astrology, or at least to avoid its complete condemnation. And here I have a funny picture to show you that Laura Fernandez shared with me a while ago. We have another example of Alfonso's love for the stars. This is from the book of the games. And the game pictured is called Checkers by Astrology. And I'm going to quote you the rules. The board, the book says, is to be 7 sides around the outside because 7 players are to play there, each one with his planet. And it has 8 concentric circles after the 8 heavens. The 8th circle is to be flat, and the figures of the 12 signs put in it as they should be which are Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And actually, if you pay attention, we see them here. Now, the image also shows Alfonso's astrological self-perception. The king plays as the sun, something that, if we didn't pay attention or catch it the first time, is made clear by a figure that holds a stick and with the sun, puts it next to Alfonso's head, right? Now, Alfonso had many other efforts to protect astrology. The 7 partidas, the siete partidas, his most ambitious legal code, were one of them. In the legislation, when he talks about divination, he rejects some types of divination, those practiced by fortune tellers and magicians, the ones that Veronica Menaldi could talk to us about more, but he endorses at the same time divination practiced by scholars of astronomy and astrology, as long as they are, and I'm quoting, practiced by those who are masters and understand it thoroughly. But this comes after he admits that divination, by definition, amounts to assuming the power of God in order to find out things which are to come. So he's carving a protected space for qualified practitioners at the same time that he's like actively engaging in heresy. Sancho is no fool. He does not negate that the planets are virtues or the stars are virtues in the Lucidario. To do so would be inconceivable for the time and an incomprehensible rupture with the best and the most current scientific knowledge of the time. He accepts it, as he accepts the virtues of stones and of plants. But at the same time, he's trying to incorporate them into a scheme that adheres to Christian Orthodoxy. And for example, when he talks about the stars, he says that they derive their power from an angel that God has placed next to them. So an angel is assigned by the Creator in a transposition of which was a really canonical text, which is the Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagites angelical hierarchy. But even then, he concludes saying that man cannot learn things from stars. So Sancho is systematically refusing to accept that men can understand the divine order completely, which is his way to reject how Aristotle was being read at the time, what he was being understood, especially by his dad. Things happen when and how God had arranged them to occur. And here I have a really nice and long quote, because this is really heavy and short. He says, even though our Lord granted great powers to Holy Mary, his mother, and the other saints, who lived and died for his holy faith, and they had the power to resurrect the dead and to resurrect themselves, and many other miracles he conducted through them, we find 3 things that he kept for himself and withheld from Holy Mary, his mother, and all the other saints. The first was to create angels, the second was to create human souls, the third was about the world's order, things about the world's order that he did not want anyone but himself to know. He holds them in his bosom until the time and season when he sees fit to reveal them by deeds, such as when the final judgment will be, which he kept for himself and did not want any saint to know except him. This is really complex. The first 2 things that God knows and no one else knows, which is to create human souls and angels, that has biblical origins that can be traced to the Bible. The last one seems to originate from the writings of some of the church's fathers, specifically Augustine. I mean, it sounds really like Augustine. In his commentary to the epistles of Paul of Tarsus in the Genesia Litera, the bishop of Hippo claims that the future knowledge is forbidden to men, and he calls them a mystery hidden from the ages in God, which will be revealed during the last judgment, when the eternal church will be gathered in paradise, etc. Now, but there's an unusual negative with the master, because there's a certain concern why to say that the Virgin and the saints are not going to know the future. Behind the master's unusual negative hides a certain concern among Sancho's theologians from excesses caused by the popularity of the cult of saints during the 13th century. Relics seem to appear under every stone. One can also think of, for example, the thaumaturgic powers, supernatural powers that some saints and kings were attributed, which on occasion works against the plans of providence. So this whole idea that saints do not know the future has an origin there. I find the inclusion of the Virgin a bit unusual, though, because it's a bit surprising. Although it might be an evidence also that Sancho does not share his father's devotion for the Virgin. Alfonso's preference for the Virgin is well known, and in the songs of Holy Mary, he even endowed her of powers or attributes that were quasi-divine. This collection of divine poems, of miraculous poems, where she often circumvents God's plans. Like God has a plan for a monk to die, and the monk prays to the Virgin, and the Virgin goes to God and to Jesus and tells him, "Could you please save him?" And Jesus is like, "No, but I love you, mom, so yes, I will do it." This is the Codex de Firenze, the Codice in the Biblioteca de Firenze that has precisely Alfonso praying to the church, who's opening the heavens where God is, right? So the Lucidario subtle censorship of the Virgin steers these Alphonsine beliefs into the right direction, reminding its readers that there's only one God that is supreme and ineffable, and that's the Trinitarian God. And now let's keep in mind how the Lucidario speaks of God's refusal to share this knowledge in the future, even with those that are closest to him in the celestial Jerusalem, which Augustine speaks. As we also remember from the beginning of the presentation, Alfonso was crazy about astrology. There's a really nice article by Craddock lately called Alfonso X Lunatico, the lunatic. He has like a crater in the moon called for him. Sancho stands against astrology and its utility to predict the future seems then a direct attack on his father's enthusiasm and patronage of this science. And this, to start wrapping up, brings us back to Fadrique, Alfonso's pesky brother that I spoke of earlier, the Sendebar. If it were to just, this is a curious data, but also reflects the extent to which astrology was accepted and used in Alfonso's time by the members of the House of Castile, because the story, the driving force of the story, which is the death of the young prince, is brought by, is initially revealed by the king's demand for his astrologers to interpret his son's horoscope, which reveals that this was a common practice at the time of Fadrique, and he didn't find it problematic. And as I said before, Fadrique was executed after his plot against the king was discovered. 5 years later, in 1282, Alfonso was dispossessed in a summary trial by Sancho, with most of the noblemen and the church officials of Castile. According to official accounts, however, the sentence was not read by Sancho, but by another of Alfonso's younger brothers, the powerful Infante Manuel. We know of the content of the sentence thanks to the General Chronicle of 1344, a text written by one of Alfonso's great-grandsons, Pedro Alfonso, Count of Barcelos, son of the King of Portugal. According to the Chronicle, Manuel said, because King Don Alfonso has killed Don Fadrique, his brother, and Simon Ruiz, Lord of the Cameros, and many other noblemen without legitimate cause, and unjustly, may he lose control of justice. And from this day on, let Infante Don Sancho be called King of Castile and Leon. It's a really powerful, emotional moment. Overall, actually, Alfonso doesn't come out well portrayed in this chronicle. For one thing, this chronicle was written around 1344, as its date indicates. But for one thing, the chronicle conveys the first account of the kings of Alfonso's blasphemy, really well-known story, whose origins have been traced back, actually, to ecclesiastical intellectuals working for Sancho. The chronicle says that Alfonso once said, had he been there with God when he created the world, he would have amended many things so that they would be better than as God made them. Something even more relevant to the, yeah. So it's sharing some of this sunshine spirit, right? And something even more relevant to the Lucidario is that Pedro Alfonso, who actually, I don't know if composed, but like was responsible for directing the chronicle, subscribes to the same critical views of Alfonso's fascination for the stars, as Sancho. On various occasions, he calls him Don Alfonso, the astrologer, right? And here we have Don Alfonso el astrólogo. Neither should we be surprised to learn that the chronicle is the first text that presents an account of what Sancho responded when he learned that his older brother had died. Therefore, he was the new heir apparent. He said, "Sir, that day that God killed my brother, Infante Don Fernando, that day he made me the heir to Castile and Leon, and all the other kingdoms where you are looted." This passage, which eerily recalls Sancho's prologue in the Lucidario, where he justifies his right to rule as an act of divine providence. Now, the final confirmation of the Chronicles' Sanchine influence is an anecdote from the beginning of the reign of Alfonso. The tale goes as follows. King Don Alfonso wanted to know how he would end his days. So he brought before him, as in the Lucidario, many astrologers, who by the means of the art of astrology found that he would be dispossessed of the kingdoms of Castile and Leon by one of his kindred. Because of this, he killed Don Fadrique, his brother, and Simon Ruiz de los Cameros, thinking this harm would come from them. The same people that later Sancho uses as an excuse. It seems that that even in this, Alfonso's faith in astrology led him to error, for he thought of Fadrique, but his appointment to death, or at least his possession and exile, was always to be with Sancho. Now, Pedro's Alfonso's Chronicle demonstrates that roughly 70 years after the Lucidarius was written, its recent theological contra-arguments to Alfonso's Aristotelian astrology had started to be popularized in all sorts of tales that justified the revolution, the Orthodox revolution that Sancho led against his father. This was Sancho's real victory, which he won by a landslide. During the following centuries, and this is a bit sad, when Alfonso's astrological books were being copied, translated, and printed by the hundreds, and this is just 2 libraries in Europe. I entered the catalog of the Biblioteca Nacional, I think it's the Biblioteca Nacional de France, and the catalog of, it could be Firenze, just 2. And I had twice as many, but they couldn't fit in the page, right? So these are the Alphonsine tables in most cases. And they're being copied, printed, and translated by the hundreds in Europe. Almost none of Alfonso's astrological books were copied in Castile. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Yeah. I don't know if anyone saw more here.
Looks like Javi has a question.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Please, those who have questions online can either shoot them into the Q&A or into the chat. And Javi does not have a question. Era un aplauso. Just an applause.
Do you know why Sancho had such a bad relationship with his father?
Well, something that I didn't say is that Sancho was the second born. Like, he had an older brother, Fernando, and Fernando died. The thing is that Alfonso had just changed the rules of succession in Castile. So up until before Alfonso's latest legal code, in theory, Sancho was to be there. The new code said that it was to be the descendants of the heir. But there were many other things. I mean, intellectually, Sancho has this orientation that is obviously more orthodox than his father. And he receives the support of the church, which in turn he uses as a machine of propaganda. So there's these things, there's really bad representations of Sancho, like in Alphonsine works. I'm thinking of a miniature that I didn't include here, but he's even reproduced, like presented as a lewd character in some of the books of Alfonso. So we don't know. We can try to guess, but I'm guessing that they didn't see eye to eye. I mean, it's like the textbook example of like a rebellious son, right? Yep.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very interesting, especially the part on philosophy. And I'm particularly interested in the idea of hiding, because of my study on veiling. So if you can talk a little bit more about how Sancho saw this, that the knowledge about God or the different, I guess, types of existence, how, if he thought that it was hidden, or was it that he thought that we couldn't have access to it because I'm looking at it from the Platonic philosophy, and they refer to this as like itegumentu, right? So it's like more like a veiling. It's not that we can't really completely access it. It's more that it's hidden and we have to uncover it through reason and philosophy. And I think you did a little bit of that when you explored the mundo, mundis, all, the words. So is it that we need to do more of that, or is it that it's just not accessible to us?
It's complicated. It's really complicated because when you start watching or reading scholastic theology in particular, because to understand Sancho's stance, we have to go to theology more than philosophy. The philosophy sets the background. Like he's reacting against how this is being interpreted. But the theologians, in turn, what they're responding, like if you read Aquinas is responding to Aristotle, to, let's say, the Aristoteles Arabicus, right? He's responding to the Averroes commentaries, things that Averroes doesn't say, and trying to put them there. But as this cute image showed before, like for Aquinas and for most of these guys, faith is always under, right? It's always under. I'm thinking of what's his name, because you're talking about Plato, and this Franciscan, whose name is escaping me right now. He's a Franciscan, Bonaventure. So Bonaventure, he's really Platonic, right? And he's interpreting the same things, the natural sciences of Aristotle, through Plato, but through Augustine. And even for him, there are certain answers that cannot be grasped just by reason. I mean, hermeneutics are useful, but there are certain things that you have to accept through revelation. And I think that that's what Sancho is trying to emphasize here. It's like,
but isn't that what everybody always said? I mean, even Rush says that. Maimonides said that. Like like Alfonso would say that. I don't know.
We'll say what? That the revelation, yes.
There's no. I mean, I have never seen a medieval philosopher who says, "Oh, it's reason."
No, but
even Al-Farabi, sometimes he will say, "Oh, he is the one," and it's like, no, he never fully goes there. They always say, "Oh, he faith."
Yes, but there's degrees, right? There's degrees of comfort with the way that you can access this knowledge. To put so much faith in certain things, and you have to consider the particular context of this. Sancho is also, and I didn't say this, he's also reacting against a current that is happening in his time, because these heresies are still happening in like 1280 and 19. Still, there's books. There's like there's a book called La Filosofía by this guy Virgilio de Córdoba that's talking about like really incendiary stuff, and he's like, yeah, we don't know if God is like so powerful, and so he's responding to multiple things, but he clearly objects his father's ideas because they could lead. It's like Star Wars. Like fear leads to anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. It's like just different degrees of something that eventually will lead into heresy or into negating some of things. And
or how he defines heresy.
Yeah.
Sancho seems like he really wants to be the one, the arbiter.
Exactly.
Of these things, right?
And he happens to be the arbiter because at the end of the day, Alfonso's works, history works, completely, like there's hundreds of copies in Spanish libraries. His books of games, less so, the cantigas, they're religious. But then when you go to the scientifics, most of the scientific manuscripts, which are really important and they're really widespread in Europe, they're kept in códices únicos. Like there's only one copy of these. Oh, we found like 20 folios of the Tablas Alfonsíes in Castellano. The rest are in French, and they have been already adapted because they disappeared, and we don't know why. But now we're starting to understand that it's like, yeah, maybe Alfonso, like Sancho's views did affect how people were seeing his father, and like Alfonso's great grandsons were like, yeah, he was kind of a lunatic, right? He was an astrologer. The fact that this story that I told you, that he called all his astrologers to predict his future, that's put at the beginning of the tale of the kingdom of the reign of Alfonso. To start the description of the history of a reign by putting that, it's to say something about like the image that the person has. It's like, imagine how we're going to think of Trump, like in, I don't know, 40, 50 years. I bet you that there's some book that's going to start with the president inviting the kids, those kids that won whatever, and having McDonald's in the White House. This is going to start with something absurd because the image of the person has like decayed so much, and because the other side has won. Right? But that's not to say that Alfonso was not loved. I mean, like he's the supernova of the time. Like in any other thing is a supernova, except in sciences where most of his things seem to have faded into a more scholastic scheme. And you have Sancho's book, and then you have other encyclopedias of the time until like the 1350s that are completely following Aquinas, following Alberto Magno, following Bartholomeus Anglicus. They're following like the order scheme of things, and you start with like, chapter 1, God. Chapter 2, angels. Chapter 3, heavens. But like God rules everything. For Alfonso, it would be a bit different.
That. I mean, that comes straight out of like Maimonides.
Yeah.
And even Daoud
But
and Robert Grosseteste had Maimonides. Like it's really hard to read Aquinas after you read Maimonides because he's very not original, you know. And it's funny how Christian scholastics are always like, "Oh no, Aquinas is doing all this heavy lifting." It's like, not really. I mean, even like the way things are structured and all the topics.
yeah, but like for Christians at least it's innovative. You know, like before that is a bit.
Yeah, but I wonder about the peninsula. You know, like that.
What happens in the peninsula?
Yeah, or it just seems like it's a wider field. You know what I mean? Like there's more voices. And
There's many more
more
voices. I
traditions.
mean, what Alfonso is saying in many spots coincides with like what Jewish interpreters are saying. I told you, like Alfonso's ideas seem out of the common. Gersonides. Gersonides says something really similar to what Alfonso is speaking of, roughly around the same period, but the reaction that we're having is also because the Lateran Council happens in 1215, I think, 1214, the Fourth Lateran Council. So like the church is really concerned about heresy. And they're like, and Castile is one of those cases where Alfonso's Lateran reforms didn't play out as planned. So Sancho is like this, and also he doesn't have power. He's second born, he has to rebel against his father. So the church support is really important. So he has to be más papista que el Papa, right? And he is.
And Alfonso never cared that much.
He ended fighting the Pope.
Yeah.
Like
But
the Pope didn't
seems to
recognize
be
him.
like the sort of personality difference.
And political too. So it's, but it's interesting how they manifest in something that has like really important after effects because 70 years later, culture is driven by this thing. Like that it comes from a political, theological, personal dislike. It's interesting to try to see. And also because he writes this text at the moment where his father cannot say anything because he's dead. Right? He's like, I'm not saying that it's you that, but it's you that. And if you,
And it's interesting, he doesn't have the vernacular.
yeah, and if you check his other books, there's a beautiful one on castigos. Like it's the book of advice on advice. There he's like, there's chapters that are like Lacanian psychoanalysis because he's like, I'm your dad and I love you and you should love me because I'm your son. And you're like, oh my God, he's talking to Alfonso. Like there's a complicated relationship of authority between them, right?
I asked one last.
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
what's the last question. And it's not super serious, but has anyone remade that game? The astrological checkers.
No, but you have I mean, like you have
It would
the
be really
manuscript.
fun.
The manuscript is online. You could like do it. Let's go to the astrological checkers.
Does it have in the text, does it have the rules?
Yeah, it has the rules. It has I have a PDF with the description of the amount of spaces. I mean, everything is planned. Sometimes it's called ajedrez por astronomía, but it's checkers. It's like escaques. So yeah, and it's like even when you zoom in, you're like, oh, you need to have your like seal of Castile there, right? Like, and the crown, and maybe like the stola. And we suspect that it's the sun, but it may also be like the thing of the king of the Castile, or like a photo of
Someone just followed you around with the,
yeah.
like,
It sounds like
Halo.
Monty Python, right? Like,
This was actually
I guess
set
it
up.
could be
This
a-
painting.
could it be a?
no, I think
Yeah.
that the consensus is that it has to be with representation of the king. Like, because why would the king be like,
Yeah.
in this text, there's not another case of that. Sarah, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just had a question sort of returning to the conversation we were having, like before the question about checkers, of like your point to, sort of this amazing way that this very complicated father-son relationship has like a large impact on sort of like cultural reproduction and like intellectual history and
Mhm.
intellectual genealogy, right? Like
Mhm.
especially in Castile and like on the peninsula. And I'm curious, like I know from Maimonides, for example, like he gets retranslated in the 15th century by Pedro de Toledo,
Mhm.
and that's like putting his work into romance, like it's like the version romanceada, like for the first time. And, so it's like it's almost like a rediscovery of the text, even though like it's been in circulation. And I'm curious, like, and I know with that comes like a sort of like a new look at it, like in this scholastic context,
Mhm.
right? Like where all of these Christian nobles are like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I'm curious, like, if no further reconsideration ever happened. From what you're saying, it looks like no further reconsideration ever happened of like Alfonso's scientific works, but did nobody ever sort of question it or go back to it and say, hey, but this is actually really great stuff?
There's a case made by Laura Fernandez that I mentioned. She's a professor at Complutense, and she has a book called Arte y Ciencia en el Escritorio de Alfonso. And she studies this, like the genesis, the history, the textual history of the manuscripts and of the books and of the ideas, and how they reach into like, in 1460, there's I don't remember his name. I remember he's called Polonius because he's Poland, and he's a professor that learns the Alphonsine science in Poland, and then goes to the Iberian Peninsula and ends up teaching in Salamanca, right? Where no one knows, and where the canons of the astrological tables of Alfonso have been lost, and he has to adapt them to work because they had been adapted in Paris and then ended up there, and then he does this voyage back. The interesting thing is that, yeah, I mean, with certain things of Alphonsine work, I'm not talking about historiography, because historiography or law, I mean, like, law is Alfonso's time. Historiography is Alfonso's time. Literature, I mean, didactic literature to a certain extent also. But with science, there's a decline. There's a decline, and there's a movement towards this type of less scientific work. That doesn't mean that there's not works, because there's at least a couple that we know that have to do with these things, and because we're talking about royal spaces, right? Like what happens in the universities is different than what happens in the royal space in the courts. But yeah, there's a really marked disappearance of things, which is a bit sad. And also because
copies too.
yeah, copies for sure. Like the Alphonsine tables disappear, and that's like they only survive in one partial manuscript that has not the tables themselves, but the prologue. The rest we know because of the Latin translation in Paris that was made like a couple of decades later, and that means that they're circulating quite early into Europe, right? Then the other books, I mean, I'm not going to lie, there's 3 or 4 testimonies of the Book of Astrology. Like one Alphonsine, one from the 1350s, so like 70 years later, and then the rest are like post-medieval.
And the Libro de las Cruces.
Libro de las Cruces, I think there's 1 or 2. The thing is that there's many post-medieval testimonies or Renaissance, but by the Renaissance, the field has changed a bit. But this particular case is interesting because by bringing Sancho's book into account, then we realize that the movement has a reason. because there's a new discourse that enters and tries to clear the field. And Juan Manuel, Michelle was mentioning that I'm editing a book by Juan Manuel. That book that I'm editing is basically the same thing as the Lucidario, but in a much smaller scale, same system of thought, which is 30 years later. So we see that the reproduction of the same model is happening, right? Within authorized spaces, within the spaces that create power, which kind of explains why, like, Fernando Cuarto, Alfonso Zeno, they don't sponsor books on science. They sponsor law, history, except science.
Speaking of authorized space, there's a question here from the chat from Anita. Thank you so much for the talk, Mario. I'm wondering what we know about Sancho's scriptorium and if the types of scribes he employed also reflected this orthodoxy. That is, did he employ only Christian scribes as opposed to Alfonso's multi-confessional teams of translators?
We don't know much about Alfonso's scriptorium. We know there's certain intellectuals like Zamora, what's his name? Juan Gil Zamora, Franciscan, that has is like one of the strong figures behind him. Then he's associated with the men in Toledo, the Arzobispo Diels. We know that there's an association, certain intellectuals, and I think that there's 2 translators that are known of Sancho, but it's not for this, it's for something else, which I cannot put my finger on it right now. But yeah, it's not the same, at the same level of Alfonso. And also because work is being atomized and work is happening. Alfonso had and this we know because there's descriptions that speak of the king going to this city and he meets with his people and they have a room where they talk and they exchange things and the king supervises what they're doing. That itself is represented in the miniatures of the Cantigas de Santa Maria. With Alfonso, it seems that the budget goes down. So he's like, okay, you guys, I'm going to hire you to freelance, do this translation. You guys can do that. We don't know as much as we want. There has been just lately a publication called Todos los Hombres del Rey by Francisco Hernández, I think, that it explores the bureaucracy around the kings, around Alfonso during the last 20 years of his rule and during Sancho's rule, which is really short actually. It's 10 years. He enters in 84, he dies in 95. So in those 11 years, it changes the panorama. And maybe that book will answer some questions. And it's also a 2-volume, 1,500 pages book in 2 tomes with a prologue by the King of Spain, Philip VI. Yeah, signed by the king. I know.
Interesting.
Yeah. So maybe that will solve your question. Anita, thank you for the question. And he says, he talks about mi ilustre antecesor, Alfonso X. Like that, those are the first words of the prologue. Times have changed.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody out in the ether. I'm going to shut down the chat soon. This presentation has been recorded. If you do want to access it, please email the Center for Premodern Studies at premodstudies@umn.edu.
We don't have enough projects.
Funding.
It would be fun.
What?
You
I like that game.
add it to your collection.
I mean, I see it happening.
I was gonna, well, ask you.